Shalom, everyone. This is Rabbi David Vazquez. Today we have a great show for you today. We have a guest who was a documentary photographer on one of the greatest or scientific research studies of all time. So today you sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. It starts right now. Shalom, everyone. Today we have the honor of having with us a well-known photographer. He has participated in programs on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, the Learning Channel, CNN, CBS, NBC, PBS, the BBC, and the Vatican Radio. His photographs have appeared in hundreds of books and publications, including Time, Life, Newsweek, National Geographic, and countless television documentaries. Our guest today is Barrie Schwortz, who was the official documentary photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project, the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the Shroud in 1978. Today he plays an influential role in the Shroud research and education as the editor and founder of the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website, www.shroud.com, the oldest, largest, and most extensive Shroud research on the internet. With more than 15 million visitors from over 160 countries, in 2009, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, Incorporated, STERA, a nonprofit 501c3 corporation to which he donated the website and his extensive Shroud photographic collection, as well as many other important Shroud resources, in order to preserve and maintain these materials and make them available for future research and study. He currently serves as the president of STERA Incorporated. Let's welcome to the show, Mr. Barrie Schwortz. Hey, Barrie, how you doing?
Good, Rabbi. Thank you for having me on the program.
Amen. It's our pleasure to have you here, and we're excited to get into this deep topic. One of the topics that we have for the show, for this podcast is the Shroud of Turin real, or is it a fake? And I guess we're going to find out by the end of this show today. What do you have to say? You were there physically with the Shroud, you touched it, you took photographs of it,
Correct.
Unlike anyone out here. We all can go, believe whatever the internet says, but we know truly what was done because you were there. So we want to get into that. So before we get into that today, we have a loaded show today. This is the first time that we do a podcast with a live studio audience. And I thank everyone for coming out here today, participating in this show today, and welcoming our guest. So we want to first start off with you telling us about how you got started in the project along with your presentation. And after that, I would ask you some questions. At the end of the show, I would open it up to the studio audience to ask you some questions. Is that good, Barrie?
Okay, perfect.
So, Barrie, I'm going to hand it over to you so you can tell us a little bit about yourself and get into your presentation.
Okay, well, we do plan on having time at the end of the presentation for questions. But there's one question I get so frequently that I like to start by answering that question before I start the actual presentation, because I think it's important that people know about it. And that question is, how did you get involved with the Shroud of Turin? Good question. So I have to start by going back to the mid-1970s when I operated a commercial photographic studio in Santa Barbara, California. I did a lot of scientific, medical, and technical work. Many of my clients were aerospace industry companies, medical device manufacturers, hospitals. So I early on built a reputation for being technically competent. Well, one of the projects that I had came along by a gentleman in Santa Barbara who worked for a company, Information Sciences, and they were a contractor to Los Alamos National Laboratory, you know, the laboratory famous for inventing the atomic bomb. And the project was a 7-month project about atomic bombs. And I can't go into a lot of detail. It was classified, and I'm not sure if it's still classified or not. But after 7 months, we completed that project. Now, interestingly enough, when you're self-employed, you know, you're waiting for the phone to ring for your next project. And the gentleman I worked with named Don Devan called me a few weeks after we finished the Los Alamos project. And I thought immediately, well, maybe another project. And he said, well, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I laughed. I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed and said, so am I, remember? So maybe the irony is that I was invited onto the Shroud team by another one of the Jewish team members. And when he asked me if I wanted to participate, and he explained to me that they'd done some experiments that indicated there was topographical information encoded into the image. So they were putting a team together to go to Turin and study the image itself, just to determine if it was a painting, a scorch, a rubbing, a photographically made image. These were all theories that were kind of floating around at the time. And so our team was put together in effect to answer those questions and determine if any of those mechanisms were the mechanism for the image on the shroud. When Devan first asked me if I wanted to be a part of this team, I said no. I didn't want to get involved in something that was a religious thing that I didn't feel qualified for. But he assured me this was strictly about the image. It was purely about science. Nobody cared what religious background any of the members had. There were 3 Jewish members, a Mormon, an evangelical, some Catholics, some Protestants, probably some atheists and agnostics as well. So ultimately and eventually I decided maybe I should join the team. It was the property of the image, which we'll get into in a little bit, that really got my attention because I knew I couldn't create those properties photographically. I was well versed in photographic technology, and I knew that I couldn't create an image with those properties. And yet there they are documented on the shroud. So with that in mind, and with the thought that in the end, this is a possibility of a free trip to Italy. I'd never been to Europe. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go do this. But once I joined that team, it became very serious. It was all about the science. It was little, if anything, to do with individual personal faith, although many of the members, I'm sure, were deep in their own faith, whatever that might have been. But it had no bearing on our work with the shroud. And I always point out to people that if I point an instrument at a piece of cloth and pull the trigger to take a reading, that instrument doesn't care if I'm a Christian, a Jew, a pagan. It doesn't matter to the instrument. It gathers the data, and that's what we did. We collected data over 5 days and nights. So the presentation I'm going to show you basically takes you, first of all, gives you a kind of an introduction to the shroud. Not too much detail, but enough to give you sort of the highlights of what's on that cloth. And then I'm going to take you behind the scenes and show you exactly what our team had to contend with to do the work that we did. We worked 5 days and nights around the clock, didn't get much sleep, but at the same time, we accomplished a very aggressive test plan with a very long list of experiments. As a matter of fact, you can see the original test plan that we submitted to the owner of the shroud, King Umberto of the Savoy family, who had owned the shroud for over 500 years. Frequently people say, well, isn't it wonderful that the church allowed you to examine the shroud? The church had nothing to do with it. The church in Turin are the custodians of the shroud, but the owner was King Umberto at that time, 1970, and King Umberto was the one who gave us permission, so the custodians begrudgingly allowed us to do it, but they were not happy. And to this day, some of the older guys over there in Turin are still resentful that a bunch of Americans from very big name American laboratories were given permission that they were never given permission to do. And that was to do an in-depth, non-destructive scientific examination of the shroud. So with that in mind, I'm going to see if I can get the PowerPoint to work now. So here we go. Let me give it a try. And so you can see I'm calling this 45 years of shroud science, a personal perspective, because this is sort of a great overview. Remember, I was the documenting photographer. And this, instead of putting a bunch of words up on the screen, as you'll see, instead I do it with photography, because that's my field of expertise. So let's start. What is the shroud? It's a 14.5 foot long, 3.5 foot wide sheet of pure linen, which in either in the Mishnah or in the Old Testament requires pure linen raiments for someone of high stature to be wrapped in and buried in. Pure linen, no mixing of the kinds, no mixing of wool or cotton with the linen. And so what makes the shroud image so unique is not so much all these burn marks and scorches that you can see along the periphery of the shroud, but it's the image within those burns and scorches. And it's a little difficult to see in natural color when you're just looking at the shroud the way it appears to the eye, which is why we use photography to enhance that information. Now, how do you get an image of a man with his head touching, or head-to-head images of a man? How would you wrap the cloth around the body to do so? And this old Della Rovera painting shows very clearly how the cloth would have had to have wrapped the body and to obtain an image like the one we see on the shroud. And in the Gospels, it mentions that there were strips of linen. Well, if you wrap a body the way you see it at the bottom of that image, and you try to move the body, what's going to happen? The cloth will fall right off. So eventually they would use the strips of linen to bind the body into the shroud itself. Now, nobody knew much about the shroud until 1898, when Secondo Pia made the first photograph. And that's the little camera he used. And I have to tell you that it's a huge, big view camera. Remember, in 1898, photography was a rather new technique. And consequently, this is the technology Secondo Pia had to work with. And he wasn't a professional photographer, although I get offended when people mention that, because he still had to use this, and then he had to process his big glass plates in his own darkroom. So calling him an amateur he was way beyond being an amateur. And in his photographs, of course, when he looked through his camera, this is what he saw. He saw the natural color image of the shroud, but glass plates in 1898 didn't make color images. They were strictly black and white. So although his eye saw this, his camera and his film saw this. Photographic negatives invert the lights and darks of the image. So what's on the shroud, in effect, is somewhat like a negative, because when you invert the lights and darks, then you get this result. And let's make it easier to look at. Let's stand the man vertically and look at half the shroud at a time. Now you can clearly see the man standing before you, and you can see how subtle the image is on the left there, but on the right, you can see the man standing clearly out. You can see his face, you can see the swollen cheekbones. So let's go down the list of things that we can see on the shroud, starting with blood stains at the top of the head from a cap or crown of thorns. Now, you know, historically through Christian art, they show a little laurel wreath-like thing of thorns. And that's because in the ancient days, when they depicted a Roman emperor or somebody of high stature, they always put a laurel wreath around his head. So Christian artists over the centuries, based on the shroud, adopted that when they did an artwork depicting the crown of thorns. But you can imagine that they didn't make some Roman soldier weave a pretty little crown to put on this person's head that they were about to execute. They took a thorn bush and they smashed it on his head. And we can say that clearly from the shroud because the blood stains on his scalp cover the entire scalp, not just in a little circlet, but entire scalp. You can clearly see the face with the swollen cheekbones. You can see one cheekbone more swollen than the other. You can see his nose. You can see the split beard. And if you go look at the prophecies in the Old Testament, they talked about when the Mashiach comes, they would pluck his beard, which first of all tells us he had a beard. And secondly, you can see a V-notch that looks like a chunk of the beard has been pulled out on the shroud. So it's not only consistent with the modern Gospels, it's also consistent with the Old Testament prophecies. Continuing down, and this is important, if you look closely, you'll see scourge marks on the front of the body, all the way down to the ankles. Now, historically, Christian artists have always depicted the scourging of Jesus with his back shredded. But if you're standing behind somebody with a three-thonged leather whip with lead balls on the end of it, if you get just a tiny bit closer to the body, they're going to come around, they're going to hit the front of the body and damage the front of the body as well. Christian artists have never depicted it that way, but that's what's on the shroud. So it's more forensically accurate than any of the artworks ever done depicting the same event. Continuing down, that line under the chin, by the way, is simply a crease in the cloth. You can see that a little more clearly here on the left under the chin. They used to roll the shroud up on a dowel and put it in a wooden box, which is not really good from a fire safety point of view. And so it caused creases to get pressed into the cloth, and that was one of them. There was also one above the forehead, but we were able to smooth that one out when we set up the shroud to photograph it. Consequently, only the one under the chin is visible. But when you convert the image to a black and white image, like we see on the right, and invert the lights and darks, that's a much more natural looking result than the original on the left. And when Secundo Pia, who made that first photograph, presented this to the public, he was immediately accused of fraud. Now, I have to kind of interject at this moment that when I talk about a photographic negative, today, anybody about under the age of 40 doesn't know what the heck I'm talking about because film has become obsolete. So trying to explain the shroud as a photographic negative itself and what it looks like on a photo made of that image gets more and more difficult to explain as the years go by. I had a 10-year-old kid ask me if film was a USB device, which makes sense for a 10-year-old. But this is the limitation that we have. Now, continuing on, we have a blood stain here in the side or side wound from a spear, and you can see a blood flow from it. These triangular shaped patches came from the damage caused by a fire in 1532, and the Poor Clare sisters repaired it, sewed in these patches, and sewed a backing sheet onto the shroud to add stability because it had been weakened by the fire damage. So those triangular patches that you see are not part of the original shroud, but they were added in 1534 to protect it, preserve it, and repair it from the damage caused by the fire. Now, you can see a wound in the wrist. You can see it a little more clearly here. You can see the blood flow down the arms. So you can see, again, these have been studied by forensic pathologists, medical doctors. These are all authentic blood stains that could only get on the shroud by direct physical contact. That's different than the image because there's image on the shroud where there wasn't direct physical contact, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. There's some more of those patches. And because of the fire in 1532 here, you can see a big diamond-shaped water stain, another one here, another one over on this side, another one up here. These water stains came from the efforts to put the fire out in 1532 that was damaging the shroud. but they were not part of the original shroud, nor are they part of the image. And because of capillarity, any dust and dirt and debris in the cloth was carried to the edges of those water stains. And believe it or not, those water stains registered on the x-rays that we took, but the image did not, which is one of the reasons we can claim the image is not a painting or made of any pigments, because there are none there. Continuing on, we have more scorches, and we have blood stains here at the feet, again from a crucifixion wound. Continuing on, the back of the man of the shroud, again you can see the blood stains covering his scalp. You can see the scourge marks on the back from the shoulders all the way down to his ankles. You can see a blood stain probably from the spear wound that flowed around to the back of the body via gravity and left a blood stain at the small of the back. You can see these L-shaped burn holes. Those did not occur in the 1532 fire. We don't know when they occurred in the shroud, but they became significant centuries later, because when the radiocarbon dating was done and they said it's a medieval thing, there happens to be an 11th or 12th century artwork in the museum in Hungary, in Budapest, that includes something called the Hungarian Prayer Codex or manuscript. And in it, it's an illuminated manuscript, and the artist, whoever he was, apparently had seen the shroud because he included those L-shaped burn holes in his artwork. They would have no other meaning other than he obviously saw the shroud, and we know that they predate that 1532 fire. The date of the Hungarian Prayer manuscript is about 75 years earlier than the earliest date given by the radiocarbon dating guys. So right off the bat, we knew there was a discrepancy, but it took many, many years later, 30 years later, before we determined why the radiocarbon dating was wrong. Now we have scourge marks, and again you can see them on the back of the ankles, the back of the feet, all the way down to the bloody footprint. Now I want you to see this bloody footprint and why that's so important. If you lay on your back and you try to put your foot flat, you have to bend your knee. You cannot put your foot flat and have your legs flat on the ground. You have to bend your knees. So we can, based on this, claim that at least that leg of the man of the shroud is bent, and many people theorize that he was in rigor mortis, and that was the position he was in on the cross when they took him off the cross. Now on the other ankle, the toes are pointing away from us, so we only can see the back of the ankle and the heel, but here we can see an entire bloody footprint. So, continuing on, here's a closer view of the scourge wounds on the back of the man of the shroud. And those scourge wounds would have been caused by, and this is an artist's conception of what a Roman flagrum would have looked like, that would have created these dumbbell-shaped wounds on the body of the man of the shroud. Now, our team didn't come along until 1976, when a couple of researchers took a photograph, a 1931 photograph of the shroud, over to Sandia Laboratories. There was an ex-radiographer expert there who had purchased this machine. I used to tell people it looks like an old stereo tuner, but today nobody knows under 40 what a stereo tuner is. So again, we're showing how dated some of these things are. This is the device, and you can see below there's a green screen monitor. And the way this device works is it takes an image, black and white, with a black and white camera, and it inputs it and displays it on a green screen oscilloscope or monitor. And here you can see when they put the shroud image in, and on the left is the image used to make these clips. This VP8 image analyzer, by the way, those green video clips on the right there, Those are taken right off the screen of an actual VP8 using my photograph on the left. So if you look especially at the bottom one, you can clearly see the natural relief of a human form. You can see the swollen cheekbones. You can see the mouth, the brow, the deep set eyes. You can see the hands. Now, this is called a VP8 because it's only 8 bits, which means it has a very limited scale of color between black and white, grayscale between all black and all white. So the images are rather crude, but it still was enough. This moment, when they saw this on that display, was the catalyst for them to decide, hey, let's put a team together and see if we can get permission to go and examine the Shroud of Turin to determine how that image was formed. And so I always tell people that normal photographs do not show the same result. And here's a perfect example. At the same time that I did the previous one, I took a photo of my friends who owned the VP8 of his grandchildren off the wall, and I put it into the VP8 just to demonstrate what a normal photograph would do. First of all, notice the little kid on the left, his hair is going down into his head. Notice that his nose and his cheeks are flat, his mouth is grossly distorted, and the little kid on the right, his face is just flat, period, with a couple of holes for the eyes and the mouth. Definitely not the natural relief of a human form. The VP8 will take any image and give you something, but what's unique about the Shroud is that yielded the natural relief of a human form. Now, knowing that this property is within the image of the Shroud, we should be able to detect that using other techniques besides the VP8 image analyzer, which by today's standards is totally obsolete. I think there's still a couple of them still functioning that are mostly on display now in Shroud museums and centers to demonstrate that property and to indicate the catalyst for the STIRP team. But this is a photographic technique that we call edge enhancement or photo relief. And it was done by professional photographer in Turin, Aldo Goreski. Aldo, because he was using film, which has a much broader range than a VP8, you can see the image is much more refined. You can see much more detail. You can see the fingers. You can see the thighs, the knees, all the way down to the feet. You can see the face, the swollen cheekbones. So this is a second method of extracting that data and demonstrating it. Same is true the back of the head, the shoulders. You can see some flattening of the shoulders and the buttocks. You can see very clearly the calves and the feet. And so this demonstrates, by using an additional technique, that is a viable property of the Shroud's image. And of course, we live in a computer age, so this is just a quick example of a face. This was done many, many years ago when computer technology hadn't advanced as far as it has today. Now people are using AI and creating all kinds of stuff. Speaking of AI, just as an aside, I've received at least 20 different versions based on the Shroud of AI being applied to show us what the man of the Shroud might have looked like. And I don't think AI is ready for prime time because all 20 or so of the ones I've received, they're all different from each other, but they all started with the same image of the Shroud. So the way I see it, AI is not quite ready to be used for any kind of scientific purposes, but it's certainly being used in other areas. Now, our team met in small groups around the country. I was in California that had all the photography and imaging guys. That included Don Lin, who you see here. This is Don Lin. He was my hero on the team. He was from the Jet Propulsion Lab, and at his tenure at the lab, he was head of imaging on Voyager, Viking, Mariner, and Galileo projects. So Don Lin was literally it's a NASA imaging scientist. For a photographer, it doesn't get too much better than that. And here you can see that all of the groups meeting in different areas. Again, I was in California. There was a group in New Mexico. There was a group here in Colorado. There was a group in back east where our medical guys came from. So we worked in smaller groups around the country. And 1 month before we were scheduled to go to Turin in September, we held a dry run. It was an opportunity for all of us to meet each other for the first time and to test out the equipment. Now, in the foreground, you see this large table. That's a steel table that was designed and fabricated to hold the shroud when we examined it by using magnets at its periphery so we wouldn't poke any holes in it or cause any harm to the cloth. In fact, the magnets themselves were coated with Teflon so as not to leave any metal particles anywhere on that cloth. What we're doing here is with a replica of the shroud, and we're just testing out the table to see how it all works. That table can rotate up into a vertical position as well, as you'll see in some of the later photographs. So we packed up our equipment into 80 crates and they were shipped off to Turin. And on September 29th, we got on an airplane and we flew to Turin. Now, I know this is a Messianic Jewish group, but I would say that make the following statement. There was no Pope when we examined the shroud, because the night before we flew to Turin, Pope John Paul I died, and they didn't elect a new Pope until October 14th after we had finished our examination. So during the 5 days and nights that we examined the shroud, there was no Pope. Now, what I'm showing you here, this is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, where the shroud's been stored for 450 years as of that, of our examination. Directly behind that and adjoining the cathedral, so they're connected, is the Guarini Chapel, and you can see the dome of the chapel here. And then you can see this square building, and that's the Royal Palace, and that's the building in which we examined the shroud. All three buildings are attached to each other, so you can go out the back of the cathedral, through the Guarini Chapel, and into the Royal Palace. The shroud is historically displayed in the cathedral, so when the public exhibition ended in 1978, they brought it through the cathedral, the Guarini Chapel, and into the Royal Palace where we examined the cloth. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that there are a lot of people standing in a queue in the line to view the shroud. Doesn't look like there's that many, but let me point out, let's look over here. See this little white building over here? Well, here's a close-up of that building. Over 100,000 people stood in a line for up to 10 hours, this is 1978, to view the shroud on public display. The good news is, since then, there's been the invention of something called the internet. I know you've heard of that. And now, when there is a public display, about a year in advance, they put up a reservation system. You can make a reservation. They tell you, show up at the time that you've chosen to be there on the date and time you've chosen. Don't show up early. And because of that, now instead of waiting as long as 10 hours to get to see the shroud, on a busy weekend, it might wait an hour, but normally during the course of the week when there are fewer people there, 20, 25 minutes at the most, and you're inside looking at the shroud. So there has been some progress made, even in the public exhibitions of the shroud. There was talk of one happening in 2025, but that's been postponed because the textile expert that's part of the International Center in Turin has examined the shroud and believes that displaying it vertically the way they've done for 100 years is causing undue strain on the cloth. So now they have to find a new way of the public viewing it without turning it up and allowing its own weight to possibly cause it some harm. Here is the inside of the cathedral. Here you can see the actual shroud on display in 78. Behind that is a big glass wall looking into the Guarini Chapel, and there's a doorway here that leads right into that. So you can see that was the way it was displayed. They allowed people to walk down the left aisle, spend about 3 minutes in front of it, and then boom, out they go, and the next group comes in. So you only get a few minutes in front of the shroud when it is on public display, and the frustration with that is it's behind thick bulletproof glass and very dimly lit to protect it from overexposure to light. And so Sometimes it's easier to see and study the shroud from one of our replicas, because you can get closer to that, than to the actual shroud itself. And the other thing you have to remember is the image on the shroud's only at its darkest point, maybe 20% darker than the background. So it's a very subtle image to begin with. This is the Guarini Chapel and the Guarini altar where the shroud had been stored for 350 years or so. Sadly, in 1997, a fire started. We're still not 100% sure how or why, but it gutted this room, destroyed the black marble altar, but the shroud had been removed because they were fixing the dome that you can see up here. They were repairing the dome. So they had removed the shroud out into the cathedral itself. So the shroud was not harmed during that 1997 fire, but this Guarini Chapel was completely gutted. The good news is I was back there a couple of years ago. It's now been completely restored except for the black marble altar in which the shroud had been stored. You see this grating here. They would roll the shroud up on a dowel, put it in a wooden casket, and put it inside the altar there. After the 97 fire, I guess they figured out a wooden box wasn't the best place to keep the shroud. It's now in a very special cabinet, no longer rolled up on a dowel, kept flat, light tight, nitrogen, argon atmosphere, temperature and humidity controlled by computers. So today the shroud is better preserved than it's ever been before. There you can see the box, and of course they wrapped it in asbestos in those days, which as we know today, not a very healthy thing to be doing. Today, that casket is in the Shroud Museum. This is what it looks like today. And the shroud, like I say, is in its own new casket. I don't have any photographs of the new one, but you can see this very long thing here. Now, this is a niche at the front of the Turin Cathedral, and inside that box is the shroud, but now it's laid out flat as I've described. So it's better preserved than it's ever been before. Now, I pointed out that Secundo Pia's camera, earlier on I mentioned it and showed you an image. There I am next to Secundo Pia's camera with one of my Nikon F2 or F3 cameras. At one point I used to joke about the difference in the technology, but today they're both equally obsolete because they both use film. And we're not using film anymore. Now, the one thing I haven't told you yet is when we arrived in Turin, those 80 crates of equipment we had shipped over had been seized by Italian customs because we had an X-ray machine with us, and on the outside the X-ray machine was a radiation sticker required by law, and that put the fear of God apparently into the Italian customs folks, so they seized all 80 crates of our equipment. We were there a week early to get the equipment, to get it unpacked, to set up the instruments, to get everything calibrated. And we lost 5.5 days before they finally released it from customs. But in the meantime, they allowed us into the Royal Palace. And although I didn't have my large camera with me, I had my Nikons with me. And so being from Pittsburgh, not too far from Philly, being from Pittsburgh, I'd never been in the Royal Palace before. So while I was there, I made some photographs. And I'm in the room where we examined the shroud, looking down a hallway, which was basically a place for storing all of our camera equipment and scientific instrument cases and stuff like that. So it was basically a utility room. But look at the opulence of it. I mean, it's pretty amazing. This is one of the frescoes. This is in the room we called the equipment maintenance room, because we had set up the ability to maintain, repair, or work on the instruments should they need any kind of fixing. And we had one or two men who were there specifically for that purpose. But I looked up and saw these amazing frescoes and photographed them. And this is the fresco in the room in which we examined the shroud. So while we were examining the shroud, when we looked up, we saw this. And when I first made these, I thought, well, these are personal photos for myself. But after that 1997 fire, this part of the palace was damaged not by the fire, but by the smoke and water from putting out the fire. And these frescoes were severely damaged. And in 1998, I had the great privilege of presenting to the Archbishop of Turin a large set of these big, large prints of these frescoes that hopefully would be useful in their restoration. I don't know if they've restored them or not. I haven't been back into that part of the palace, which was closed the last time I was there. Now, after 5.5 days, they finally released our equipment and they loaded it onto a dump truck. So imagine how we felt. This is in the courtyard of the Royal Palace. And I went running down there, and somebody ran up to the driver, fearing that he was going to pull the lever and just dump everything out on the ground. And of course, the driver just laughed and said, no, but please unpack my truck. So we then had to unpack the truck. And now we're down to a day and a half before they're supposed to bring us the shroud. And we're now just unpacking all of these boxes off this truck and having to load them into the Royal Palace. And eventually we got it done, but barely in time. As a matter of fact, we were still finishing up when they actually eventually brought us the shroud. But here's a good view of the steel table. And if you look closely, you can see there's removable panels that are in this table. And those panels had to be, they had to design it with removable panels because we were going to do x-rays, and you can't do an x-ray through steel. So this is the table set up, and around the edges are map coordinates so that we could specify specific areas of the shroud. That's me poking my head around the edge of the table. I don't know what that instrument is, but you probably have an app for it in your iPhone. This was before solid state electronics, so temperature for some of these instruments was critical. In fact, we even had one instrument that was water cooled, and other instruments that were cooled with liquid nitrogen. All of our infrared thermal imaging equipment had to have liquid nitrogen in it, and if the liquid nitrogen completely was expended, the instrument was a piece of junk. It would have been destroyed. And remember, this was all tied up in customs for 5.5 extra days. So when we got the equipment, they immediately unloaded these, and they had a big dewar of liquid nitrogen. When they opened it up, there was just enough liquid nitrogen left in the instruments for them not to have been damaged by the 5.5 day delay. Here, Vern Miller in the foreground, Ernie Brooks in the background, unpacking some of the photo gear. And this is the equipment maintenance room. Remember, you see that fresco up there? I showed you that a few minutes ago. Notice that there are garden hoses stretched out. And if you look closely, back here's the door, and through that door is into the room where we examine the shroud. So what's with the garden hoses? And also notice the parquet wooden floors. They're going to make a difference too. So here's the deal. The only operating bathroom was at the far end of the hallway to my left as I'm making this photo through the doorway. So we had to go out and buy a bunch of garden hoses and string them all together and hook them up in the bathroom and run them down the hall through the equipment maintenance room and into the room where we examine the shroud. And you can see them coming in here so that they could make that instrument, water-cooled instrument work. And another view of the table, and notice you can see here that the table can be rotated so that it can be vertical the way you see it here, or flat. We also were doing thermal imaging, infrared imaging, and because of the shutters on the windows not being 100, I mean, they're 400 years old or older, there were cracks and sunlight would shine through, and if they hit one of the instruments, it could damage the instrument. So we had to put gold foil or foil over the windows to make sure that no sunlight came in and did any harm. Here's Don Devan. This is the man who invited me onto the team. I don't know if I said it before, but it's kind of ironic. I got invited onto this team by another Jewish man. God works in mysterious ways. This is not me. This is Sam Pellicore, an optical physicist, and this is Vern Miller, the chief scientific photographer. And here they're setting up a camera on the camera support system. They're measuring the distance between the film plane and where the shroud would be, and they sandbag this in place. Remember, the shroud's 14.5 feet long, so when you slide your camera along this rail, you want to keep the same distance so that later on when you do sectional photos of the shroud, they'll all go together because the camera was at exactly the same distance. 20 years later, when I had my two 4x5 transparency films digitally scanned, I was able to put the two together to create the entire shroud with no problems, because these guys thought to do what they're doing right here. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Italy, but things don't always run on time in Italy. It's what they call Rome time. So imagine our chagrin when an hour and a half ahead of schedule, here's the back door to the Guarini Chapel. They just brought the shroud wrapped in red silk through the door of the Guarini Chapel, down the hallway, and into the room in which we were to examine the shroud. Now, notice the table in the background with those removable panels I mentioned, but notice that they don't look the same anymore. That's because when we unpacked the table, we found a white powdery oxidation on the steel. It wasn't stainless steel, because stainless steel is treated as it could be harmful, so it was just plain steel. But we had two NASA scientists on our team, and they anticipated that that might be an issue, so they brought with them several rolls of the gold foil mylar that you've seen in the cargo bay of the space shuttle or on satellites, and that's gold impregnated mylar. And they actually had to cover each of these panels with that gold foil mylar so that we didn't contaminate the shroud. And here you see the shroud's already in the room with us, and they're unwrapping it, and notice we hadn't even yet finished covering the panel. So that's how tight to the wire we were because of the 5.5 days that we lost. This is our first look at the shroud. There's a little humorous story behind this. On the left are the Italian guys, on the right are the Americans. The Italian guys, whether they were being serious or trying to be funny, told us that, okay, they accept that we were going to examine the shroud, but if we touched it, we would be shot by the Carabinieri, the state police in plain clothes that were guarding us and ostensibly the shroud. So notice where the Italian guys' hands are. They're ready to touch the shroud. Notice where the American guys' hands are, behind their backs. Well, how do you examine the Shroud of Turin with your hands tied behind your back? You don't, obviously. And so obviously once Professor Gio, this gentleman here, started handling the shroud, we all realized that that was not going to be a problem. Now here you can still see two of the panels still not covered with the mylar yet, but now you can see that the shroud is fastened to a white painted piece of wood. And since we don't have an interactive back and forth here, I'll just tell you how they attach the Shroud of Turin to a white painted piece of wood. They used thumbtacks. So that means every time they pulled out a thumbtack, there was a little circle of rust and a hole of rust. And they had to pull out about 100 thumbtacks. As a matter of fact, here you can see them removing the thumbtacks before we could proceed. And they were worried about us causing harm to the shroud, when in fact, you can see very clearly that we were extraordinarily careful and planned everything very much with great care and in advance. Because when you're in Turin and you forgot something, you can't quickly run home to pick it up. You better have thought of it in advance and brought it with you, which is what these amazing scientists did on our team. Here you can see the tables are now rotated down into the horizontal position. And now, after all the thumbtacks are removed, we were able then to put the shroud onto the table and fasten it with magnets. Why are the magnets white? They're coated with Teflon, again, so that no particulates of any metal of any kind from the magnets would be left on the shroud. Teflon, as you know, is inert. Now, up first was Max Frei. Max Frei was a Swiss criminalist. They gave the first 12 hours to the Italian group, probably to keep them from being very unhappy, because they weren't thrilled that we were there. So they let them go first. And this was one of their colleagues from Switzerland, which is just up the road a piece from Turin. You can actually see the Matterhorn, the real one, from downtown Turin. That's how close to Switzerland it is. Anyway, Max Frei was a Swiss criminalist, had pioneered the use of sticky tape on the clothing of crime scene victims to remove dust, dirt, and debris from the clothing that might help solve a crime. So apparently on his way over to the palace that day, he stopped off and picked up the cheapest roll of dime store sticky tape he could find. And we were kind of freaked out about it because we too had a tape experiment, but we went to 3M, and 3M made a tape that we could put on the shroud and peel it away without leaving any gummy residue on the surface of the cloth. Max Fry, wherever he stuck his dime store sticky tape, left some gum there that eventually had to be cleaned off because it attracted dust and dirt. But worse than that, he put the shroud through undue pressure, and we were freaking out when he was doing this. And he was just about to do that onto the face of the man of the shroud, the most iconic part of the shroud's image. And so John Jackson, on the right, co-founder of our team, is having a very serious discussion with Max Fry. And if the man in the middle, who's Professor Luigi Ganella, was the scientific advisor to the Archbishop of Turin, if it looks like he's acting as a referee and these two guys are about to come to blows, that's exactly what's happening. That's really what's happening. And it was decided after about a 10-minute heated discussion, nobody would put any tape on the face. Elsewhere, fine, but on the face, no. Ultimately, Max Fry finished, and then this gentleman on the right, Professor Giovanni Rigi, was given the next opportunity. He had been notified 2 weeks before we arrived that the Americans were coming and they needed an Italian to come up with an experiment or two so that they could go first. Well, Rigi was a good scientist, a smart man, and he came up with an idea that, remember, the shroud had had a backing sheet sewn onto it by the poor Clare sisters in 1534. He decided to separate the shroud from its backing sheet, not completely, but in one or two areas, where he could insert a vacuum and vacuum some dust and debris from between the two cloths, and then insert an endoscopic camera system that worked with a long fiber optic cable. And so here you can see them separating the shroud from the backing sheet. Now, interesting enough, as I'm making this photograph, I realize it's been 450 years since anybody's seen the backside of the Shroud of Turin at this moment in history. So I went around to the other side of the table just in time to capture the very first look at the backside of the shroud in 450 years in a photograph that's actually become quite well known. It's been in Time and Life and National Geographic. I don't remember it's been everywhere. And I think what makes it an important photograph isn't so much what they're doing as the expressions on their faces. These are a bunch of really serious scientists. This was not taken lightly. This was done with great respect, but also with great detail to doing good science. I've said this publicly, I'll say it to you as well, that those of us involved with the shroud from a scientific point of view have to do the best science possible, and that doing bad science is worse than doing none at all, because the skeptics will use any bad science that comes out about the shroud that isn't viable to attack the shroud and dispute its authenticity. So doing good science is critically important. Some people get upset with me for focusing mostly on the science. I'm not a theologian, that's the rabbi's job. And so I leave the rabbi to do that, and I talk about the science because that's what I was a participant in. That's what eventually convinced me the shroud was authentic. It wasn't a theological decision, it was a scientific one. You don't need to be a Christian to accept the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth and to accept the peer-reviewed science that tells us this was his cloth that wrapped his body. I don't know what the sister was thinking, but I'm sure she was stressed out watching us poking and prodding the shroud. Her responsibility was the care of the shroud. And so I captured this. I'm sure she's gone now because she was an elderly woman, but my heart went out to her because I could understand how she felt as well. Those are her hands, and here you can see she's lifting a small sample from the from the cloth, not for us, but for the Italian research. Ricci, once he got, and I think I'll show you the next photo there. He put a thing in to separate the shroud from the backing sheet and hold them apart. And here's his vacuum. You can see that down here. This is the vacuum hose. And up in the handle are sterile filters. So he could vacuum an area, remove the filter, seal it, put in a new unused filter, and vacuum a different area. Very clever. The only problem with the dusts that he gathered from between the two cloths, from a scientific point of view, you need to know where a particular particle might come from if you're going to make any scientific claims for it. Did it come from the shroud? Did it come from the backing sheet? Did it get trapped in between when the sisters were working on it? So the provenance of anything from those dusts is questionable. So although that didn't really give us a whole lot of new data, it was considered, a very clever idea considering how little time he had to prepare. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. Professor Ricci knew that his endoscopic camera could see a circular image 10 centimeters in diameter. Well, if you insert the camera between the shroud and the backing sheet, how do you know exactly what you're looking at from underneath? Well, it turns out he took and had a grid fabricated of 10 centimeter squares that he could lay on the shroud. Then he would turn on the focusing lamp and center it, and he knew precisely where he was looking at. To me, that was brilliant. A very simple, elegant solution to a problem. I don't think I would have thought to do that. But when he turned on that focusing light, I immediately called for the room lights to be turned out, because there's something important about this image. And that is the forehead blood stain. And when you look at it, you can see that not only did it soak into the cloth, but when you transmit light through the cloth, it added density there. Now remember, one of the theories was the shroud was painted. And if something had been applied to the shroud to make the image, if we saw the entire shroud with transmitted light, any paint that was applied would show up just like the blood stains. So they asked me to photograph the entire shroud with transmitted light, which was added to my list of tasks. And here's that photograph. And this is the first opportunity where I can show you some hard science that, and watch out, I'm using the word proves, that nothing was added to create the image on the shroud. Take a look. See the spear wound blood stain, the blood stain of the arms. You can see the periphery of the water stains, the scorches, the patches, the spear wound. Unfortunately, you can't see the blood stains on the head because the light behind there was kind of overrode it. What don't we see? We don't see any image. Why? Because nothing was added to the shroud to create the image. Here's a reference. There it is, and there it is. There's nothing added to the Shroud of Turin to create that image. The image lives in the top few microns on the top fibrils of the fibers on the surface of that cloth. That's all. Any liquid, paint, pigment, or even water and blood penetrated through the cloth via capillarity and shows up on the transmitted light photos, but not the image itself. So that's the first piece of hard evidence I can show you that proves that what I'm telling you is the truth. Now, because our team used some very sophisticated instruments and because this has already gotten pretty long, I'm going to go through these rather quickly. I'm going to show you the instruments, and I've noticed I haven't put a lot of words on the screen, but right now I'm just putting the tests on the screen that these instruments were responsible for. That way you can see the instruments, you can see, and I don't have to put you to sleep reading off these big long titles. Now, what's interesting about this today is notice that the output of this is a spectral instrument, the best that was available in 1978, top of the line. The output was to a chart recorder, not to a computer the way we would do it today, of course. Not only that, this box was huge and on its own cart had to be rolled around. Today, the box would be almost handheld. And so the technology, it's 46 years later, folks. Now, remember I told you about the problem we had of our equipment being seized? Well, here's the reason why. See that little X-ray machine in the middle there? That's the little device that was in a crate that had a radiation sticker on the outside of it. And it's a very low power X-ray. Here's an example. You know when you go to the dentist and he does an X-ray in your jaw, it takes about 1 second to expose the X-ray. And then he processes it, or today I'm not sure if they even process, it just comes out digitally. Well, the typical exposure with this device on the shroud was 20 minutes. 20 minutes per exposure. And remember those parquet wooden floors I pointed out to you earlier? Well, they moved when you walked on them. So to do the X-rays on a 20-minute exposure, if you're walking around, you're going to cause movement in the X-ray device and you're going to blur the X-rays. So they had to do all the X-rays in the middle of the night, and we all had to leave the room as they were exposing their film, because in addition to the wooden floors, they used to route traffic right next to the Royal Palace buildings. Every time a truck or a bus went by, the whole building vibrated. So they had to wait until the middle of the night to shoot their X-rays when the traffic had subsided, and we all had to get out of the room. 20 minutes. Now, once you've made the X-rays, now what do you do with them? Do you bring them back through the airports where there's 50 X-ray machines? Not a good idea, because random X-rays could damage the X-rays we had exposed. And this is what one of the actual X-rays looks like. So what did we have to do? We decided that the only solution was to process the X-rays on site. Now, what does that mean? It means, what do you need to process X-rays? Well, number one, you need a room that can be made dark. And number two, you need a water supply. Well, guess what, folks? That's what. We actually had to pirate the bathroom, turn it into a dark room for an hour at a time when the X-ray guys needed to process their film. You know, it's kind of humorous in a way, but we had to make do with what we had. But think of the brilliance of these scientists to anticipate that this could be an issue and bring with us the technology to solve that problem. And that's why we have 43 X-rays made over those 5 nights by these guys who had to be up in the middle of the night to do it. We also did photomicroscopy, photographs through a microscope. This is one of the blood stains on the shroud. Notice it's still slightly reddish in color. And so, and we did a whole bunch of these, but because of timing, I want to go through these as quickly as possible. UV fluorescence photography, I'm not going to try and explain it, but I will just give you a brief overview. There's a UV ultraviolet filter over the flash units and another ultraviolet filter over the lens. So the flash units go off, causing anything on the shroud that might fluoresce to fluoresce under UV excitation. And then the film only captures that fluorescence. So that's one of the important experiments, because it can show you things that the unaided eye might not be able to see. And here's an example of that. This is the spear wound in the side. You can see the oval shape of the wound. But if you look closely, you'll see there's kind of a halo around the blood stain. That's serum, because the serum, the liquid portion of the blood, via capillarity extends beyond where the solid portion of the blood stops. And it's only visible with UV fluorescence photography. So explain to me how a medieval hoaxer could even think to do this. It's ludicrous. Doesn't happen. So you can see that some of the techniques we brought with us help to reveal things that the unaided eye might not even be able to see. And you've already seen my transmitted light images, and my reflected images were regular natural light images. But there I am actually making my photographs of the shroud. Here you can see the camera rail system. And for anybody who might be an old-fashioned photo buff, that's a Speed Graflex 4x5-inch camera that shoots 4x5-inch sheet film. It's the same camera the press photographers used in the 30s and 40s. I was also responsible for documenting where each of the researchers took their data points from. So since we're already on a steel table, and we were already using magnets to hold the shroud in place. We got a Teflon-coated small circular magnets, handed them to the researchers. So once they took data from a specific area, they would put a magnet in that place. And once they finished in that general area, they would bring me in and I would make a photograph like this. Once we got back, I spent a month superimposing those onto a larger image of the shroud to create a series of maps, ventral and dorsal, of 4 of the different experiments. And you can find these on shroud.com with much more detailed explanation than I'm going to give you here. Again, I don't like to put a lot of words up on the screen, because what do we do with words on the screen? I have to read them to you. And if I have to read them to you, what do we do with words? We typically read to our children to put them to sleep, and I'm trying to keep you awake best I can. Now, I told you we had our own sticky tape samples. Notice that instead of a dime store applicator like Max Fry used, Ray Rogers, the lead chemist on our team from Los Alamos National Labs on the left, and Dr. Robert Deniger, a physicist from Los Alamos on the right, are using what is called a torque applicator, which they designed and had fabricated. It's a little hard to see, but if you look right here, there's a scale, and this is a pointer. And when they applied pressure, this was calibrated, so they knew exactly how much pressure they were applying to the tape when they applied it to the shroud, unlike Max Fry, who used his thumb. So as you can see, we were a little more sophisticated. And then Rogers understood when he peeled those tapes off, if he stuck them down onto glass, anything trapped in the gum of the tape was going to get more deeply embedded anyway. So he designed and had fabricated these well slides. If you'll notice, there's a few millimeters of space, and you can see these tape samples are only touching at these edges, and underneath the main portion of the sample is a few millimeters of space. Again, all of this anticipated in advance, designed and fabricated before we ever left for Turin. Pretty amazing science. Now, I have to add that we did have a computer, sort of. It only did this and never did anything else. This is the computer with all these red and blue switches, very nice. Have no idea how they work or what it did. Hard to see, but underneath that computer is a big box that was an 8-inch floppy disk drive unit. And this is a terminal, which is a keyboard and monitor in one unit. And he could only ever get it to do this. And here's the irony. You see it says IMSI 8080. That tells you the chip that's in this computer. You know those little dime store clocks that we buy, little LED clocks that you buy them for like 2 for $1. And when the battery dies, you throw it away and put up another one, stick it on your fridge. That's the chip that's in that computer. And here's the real irony. This was a kit he had to build. Well, for whatever reasons, he couldn't make it work. Just imagine if they allowed another round of testing today with the 46 years of advancement, not just in computers, but in all these other technologies. Many of the questions that remain unanswered, many of the new questions that came from the data that we collected might be answered if another round of testing were permitted. Now, even though I've promised you not to put a lot of words on the screen, this is a summary of the conclusions of the STIRP team. And it's the only time I'm going to make you read something because it's so important that I get it right. So I felt I would just quote this. This is from the summary of our final report that was presented in October of 1981 at the final meeting of our team. And this was designed for the public, so they minimized some of the high-tech verbiage and tried to simplify it enough to make it viable for a press release. And perhaps the best sentence that there is, the image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists, or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. But maybe the most important statement is right here. It is not the product of an artist, and we proved that scientifically. So the next time some skeptic tells you, oh, the shroud, that's just a fake, you have now seen just an overview of some of the data that proves the skeptics are wrong.
thank you for giving us that presentation, that inside look behind the scenes of what you guys were doing there. That
Well,
profound work.
you know, people hear a bunch of scientists, they expect we're all in white lab coats in a stainless steel and enamel room, not in a 400-year-old dusty old palace. But I think we adapted pretty well to what we had to do.
I
And,
agree with you. I think you guys did a tremendous job in what you did do, and I imagine we're still
and our
talking about it
work,
today.
yeah, our work published in peer-reviewed scientific journals is the foundation of all the peer-reviewed science that exists on the Shroud of Turin to this day.
Wow.
Look what we started.
Yeah, that's right. Wow. Thank the Lord that God chose you for a special project such as this.
How long did I go? I wasn't tracking time.
It doesn't matter. A good 45, maybe 50 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Under an hour, and I feel I did a pretty good job.
We're doing good timing,
But-
So,
Look, Rabbi, getting me started is easy. It's getting me stopped is hard.
don't worry, we have an eject button here.
Oh, good.
Just
Gonna
kidding.
knock me right out of my chair.
Just kidding. So, one of the questions I have for you is, you've been doing it for so many years, and I know at one point you were a skeptic about the shroud. You didn't truly believe
Absolutely.
who the person was on the shroud. What do you have to say today about that?
Well, I never doubted who the man of the shroud was, but it took me 17 years before the science convinced me that it was his claw.
And what convinced you?
Everything, all of the above. Think about this. I had access to all the science right from the beginning. I participated in collecting that science. And it still took 17 years in getting all my questions answered before I finally came to the conclusion that the only plausible answer is that this is an object that wrapped the historic Jesus of Nazareth. That's not, that doesn't say whether or not, doesn't consider whether or not he was the Messiah.
Right.
That's a separate question in my mind, because I was there to do science. Is it possible? And I didn't share this before, so I'll share it now. What my little Jewish mother said when she heard one of my lectures. I was in Pittsburgh, which is my hometown, not too far from you guys, across the state. And my Catholic friend said, look, while you're here for the high school reunion, why don't you do a shroud lecture? I said, okay, arrange it. And so the Archdiocese of Pittsburgh gave me a venue, put me on the radio, put me in all the bulletins of all the churches, and we had a huge turnout, and my mother was there, and my brother was there, and my cousins were there, you know, the family, you know how it is. And we had a wonderful time, and it was a great venue and a great presentation. And we're driving home. And I don't know if I need to tell you this, Rabbi, but my mother was silent. When a Jewish mother is silent, be afraid. It's not a good thing. You know.
Yep.
Okay? And so I finally, I was kind of baffled by her silence. And so I finally said to her, okay, Mother, what do you think? And I was expecting, I don't know what I was expecting actually, but I was shocked at the answer. And she said, well, of course it's authentic. And already I'm in shock. Took me 17 years after leaving my DNA on it. She hears one lecture and she's convinced. I said, what makes you say that? She said, Barrie, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years. If it had belonged to anyone else, it wouldn't have mattered. This is from a little Jewish lady, born in Poland, immigrant as a child to America. And yet she saw something that I didn't see. Think about this. Whoever rescued that cloth out of the tomb put themselves in as much risk as Jesus himself.
That's right.
Now, would you do that if it was just your neighbor down the street, Joe Blow? Or would you do that if it was worth the risk to preserve something of someone you believed to be the prophesied Messiah?
Yeah.
So my mother's observation, Jewish mother logic, pretty amazing.
That's right.
Pretty amazing.
Awesome. Now, I know there was a part about one of the things that convinced you had to do about the blood. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I didn't go into it because it was getting long already. So yeah, so Dr. Alan Adler was the third Jewish guy on the team. He was a blood chemist. And in 1995, I was on the phone with Al, who was quite a character, never drove a car one day in his life, had to be driven everywhere. You know, when God gives you a gift of brilliance, he takes something away to keep us all equal. So poor Al never drove a car, but he had the greatest sense of humor. He was a little bit Meshuggah, if you know what that means. And so I'm on the phone with Al, and I say to Al, well, you know, I said, so far nobody's explained why the blood is still reddish. Old blood turns black or brown generally within 30 minutes or sometimes less. And Al said, oh, okay. He says, well, he said, look, he said, when I did the chemical analysis of the blood, I found a whole high content of bilirubin. Bilirubin being a compound, I think, made in the liver, floods the bloodstream. When I talk to certain audiences, I always say bilirubin, not a Jewish guy from New York. But he said the high content of bilirubin, he said, and bilirubin releases hemoglobin, which is a hemolytic agent, breaks down the red blood cell walls, stays red forever. That was enough for me, coming from the horse's mouth, so to speak. That was the last piece of the puzzle. So in 1995, after my conversation with Al Adler, I said, you know what? That's it. This has got to be the real thing. But that was 17 years later. Wow. Wow. Now, ironically, and this is sort of the tail end of that story, very shortly after I had that conversation with Al Adler, I got a phone call from a friend of mine. He goes, hey, you know that Shroud thing you're involved with? And I laughed and I said, yeah, I know that Shroud thing I'm involved with. He said, well, you know, turns out that's just a photo made by Leonardo da Vinci. So I thought he was joking. I laughed. And I said, he said, no, I'm being serious. And I said, okay, so where are you getting that information? And he said, well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store. It was on one of the tabloids. And I realized here I am with access to every bit of the data that I've had right from the get-go, but the general public doesn't read peer-reviewed scientific journals that are only accessible through university research libraries. And while I'm on the phone with that man, I had a manila envelope on my desk. And on that envelope, I wrote, consider building a website. I believe that that phone call was the moment that God reached down, smacked me upside the head, and said, here's the real plan. And that's what prompted me to build Shroud.com.
Wow.
So it all happened in a very short period of time.
Thank goodness you heard that voice from above.
Well, somebody said, many are called, but only some answer.
That's right. That's right. So, Barrie, I have a couple of questions for you I'm going to ask you. And
Sure.
I guess you don't have to go into a long thing, but yes, it's more like a yes or no to verify this is actually true.
That'd be a rare question indeed, Rabbi.
So one of the things for me that made me very skeptical about the Shroud until recently was the big thing. Yours was the blood. I knew about the blood. That wasn't a factor for me. What was a factor for me were the rumors of people saying there were coins that were placed on the eyes of the man on the shroud, knowing that, you know, we as Jews don't believe in that, don't believe that we have to pay the man in the river Styx to cross over to the next side. So
Right.
that was a big thing for me.
The
saying to me,
ferryman.
this man wasn't Jewish. So was there any coins on those eyes?
I absolutely disagree with that conclusion. Now, it is possible that they used pot shards, broken pieces of pottery to keep the eyes closed. That's possible. but I have told people countless times, coins are not part of Jewish burial customs, not then and not now. Even flowers are not part of Jewish burial customs. And I've told people, go to a Jewish cemetery. Don't bring flowers, because there'll be a bucket of stones.
That's right.
And you will pick up a few of those stones and you will put them on the gravesite.
That's right.
No flowers, no coins. Some people say we can read the inscription on the coin. It's a lepton, a pagan coin. And so my question has been to these people, do you truly believe that the disciples of Jesus, many of whom believed he was in fact the Messiah, would have put a pagan coin on his face? And the guy who was promoting that theory said, oh, they used whatever they had in their pocket. And my answer was, you obviously don't know any Jews. So no coins. If there's coins, they certainly wouldn't have used a pagan coin. They might have used a shekel, which was the coin of exchange that the Jews used.
Right.
But it's never been a part of Jewish burial custom.
Correct. Okay.
I ain't buying the coin.
So the next thing would be is, I know, even though you did not do any research on this itself, but I know you've heard of it, the Siderium of Oviedo, the actual...
Oviedo, yeah, I've seen it in person.
The cloth that supposedly was the cloth that was placed on Jesus, Yeshua's faith.
When they removed him from the cross and brought him to the tomb. It's mentioned in the Gospels.
Yes, yes. So the question is,
It says it was...
in looking into this, we see that some people have said that the actual blood from the shroud matches the same blood that's on this particular face cloth.
Yeah, that was done by the Centro Español de Sinologia, the International Center of Study of the Shroud and the Sudarium in Spain. And they've superimposed them, and you can see that the blood stains on the Sudarium line up with the face of the man in the shroud 1-to-1 perfectly.
Wow. Wow.
And when people challenge that, I say, look, when I first read the New Testament, because I'm not a New Testament guy, I'm not an Old Testament guy either, but when I first read those passages, as soon as I saw that cloth was separate, but in the tomb, I said, authentic Jewish burial? Because only the Jews put so much importance on blood that any blood of the decedent that can be salvaged and buried with the body is done so to this day.
Yes.
They're still doing that. So I dispel that nonsense as fast as I can.
Yeah, that's very, it's interesting that that Siderium, the cloth actually matches the same blood stains from the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
They're in two different locations, different tests have been done. Yeah.
Absolutely. If you go to shroud.com and use the search engine, look up, just type the word Siderium, and you'll find a lot about it, because I believe there is a relationship between the two. And some of the best research done on that came from the folks in Spain that have possession of it. And I got to see the actual cloth.
Right. Wow. Okay, so another question would be and I think you've already answered this in part of what you were showing in your presentation. As one of the prophecies of the Moshiach in the Old Testament says, Ishayahu, the book of Isaiah says, Isaiah 50 verse 6 says, I offer my back to those who beat me and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. And apparently you said also, as you were doing the presentation, that the man on the shroud, his beard was plucked from his face.
Yeah, and some people said, no, Jesus, the man of the shroud has a beard, and it says, I said, nowhere does it say they gave him a shave.
Right.
They said in the prophecies they would pluck his beard, which, what does that tell you? He had a beard.
Yes.
Okay. And plucking a beard is not the same as shaving it off.
Correct.
So the skeptics use that until I point out that, take a look at that V-notch. It looks like somebody ripped a chunk out, and look, you and I both have beards. Mine's a little longer than yours, maybe. If you've ever caught one hair in the zipper, it brings tears to your eyes.
Oh, yeah.
So imagine pulling out a chunk of his beard. It would have added to his torture and misery.
Yes. Okay. Another theory that I've heard a lot lately was that first century Jews had short hair, so it's impossible for Yeshua, Jesus, to have long hair. Did the man on the shroud have long hair?
Yes. And here's why. The passage quoted by skeptics, frequently Protestant skeptics particularly, is from Paul's letters to Corinthians.
Correct.
And he was sort of chastising the men of Corinth for adorning their hair kind of in a feminine style. That was written 20 years after the crucifixion. Did not apply to Jesus, who followed the laws of Moses, which forbids the cutting of the beard and the hair. And look at, I always tell people, go to any Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox congregation. Today, men have long hair and beards.
Yes.
That's called for in the laws of Moses. Those are the laws Jesus followed.
Correct.
Not the ones that came 20, 30 years later.
Yes. So one of the things also I saw in the shroud was the man, of course, he had long hair. One of the, I guess, videos I saw on YouTube was that he had like a ponytail in the back or something. It was like long. I think mine is longer than yours, but you can't see it.
You're wearing a kippah there, aren't you?
I'm wearing a kippah.
Yeah, I'm not.
You have a natural kippah. That's also important.
Yeah, it's getting that way. Well, I always used to joke about a race between Gray and Gon has started to win.
So he did have long hair. It was very long in the back.
Yeah, that's consistent with what a first century Jewish man would have.
Okay. So another question was, and we talked about this, but you mentioned about him being whipped. So in Mark chapter 15, verse 15 talks about, so Pilate was wishing to satisfy the mob and set Barabbas free from them, and he had Yeshua whipped and then handed him over to be executed on the stake. So he was whipped. You can see this physically, correct, on the shroud itself.
Yeah, scourge marks not just on the back, but also on the front. No Christian artist throughout the history has ever depicted that. And yet that's far more forensically accurate than anything any artist has ever done.
Correct. Even movies today, you don't see that in movies unless you see The Passion, which is...
Mel Gibson only did the back.
Yeah.
But in reality, you can't get behind somebody and whip them without some of them hitting the front.
Correct. So we also know that in Matthew 27:29 talks about they made woven branches into a crown and put it upon his head. So according to what you were able to see in the shroud, the thorns would have gone not just around the head, but also above the head, all around.
Over the scalp. Look, you're going to tell a Roman soldier, here's a guy we're going to kill him any minute now. But before we do that, since he's proclaimed himself King of the Jews, let's make him a pretty crown. No, that's ridiculous. They took a thorn bush and they smashed it on his head.
Wow.
Oh, here's your crown, King of the Jews. It's very hard for us in the 21st century to put ourselves into the mindset of a first century person, right. Jew or otherwise.
Right.
And so we apply what we know of our culture today, but you can't do that back then. I mean, it's 2,000 plus years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think everything about, and trust me, that all these questions you've been asking me, I had to deal with all those before I got to where I am today.
Right. Wow. Well, pretty much, I don't want to get into too many more questions from my behalf. I want to have, if anybody here in the studio audience wants to come up and ask Barrie a question concerning the shot, something maybe that you want to know in detail, he could be the person that can answer it for you. So anyone just want to come up, you can come up now. Remember, when you come up to the microphone, just talk freely.
And you'll push the button so I can see him?
Yep.
Shalom, Mr. Schwartz. I do have
Shalom.
Bring the microphone down.
Okay.
And talk loud.
Yeah, there you go. That'll do it.
Okay. I do have a question.
Nice and loud. Thank you.
Nice and loud.
Speak loud? Okay. I do have a question about when you were studying the shroud, his shoulders, because it was said in the Gospels that he carried his cross. Was there any evidence of that with his shoulders?
Yeah, but not so much on the shoulders, but on the back of the shoulders. There was abrasions on the shoulder blades, not up here, but further behind him, because he would have carried it this way and it would have abraded the back of his just below his neck, and there are abrasions on the man of the shroud in that area.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
Good question.
I was wondering, after you and your colleagues investigated the shroud, did you see any conclusive evidence that this man was Jewish? Some people said that there was marks of tefillin on the wrist, the left wrist.
Yeah, that's total
forehead.
nonsense.
Do you know if that's true
Yeah,
or not?
No. Look, you heard me mention Ray Rogers, the chemist from Los Alamos. He used to lecture me all the time that "I think I see" is not a scientific statement.
Correct.
And people have imagined all kinds of, if everything were actually on the shroud that people believe they have seen there wouldn't be room for Jesus.
Yeah, correct. And one of the things is, one of the things we talked about was, during the time of first century, Jews did not bury the dead with tefillin. So there was no tefillin.
Yeah,
there.
not to this day.
Not to
I
this day.
still have my grandfather's tefillin.
If anything, more like the talit would be buried with the dead, but not tefillin.
Perhaps, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So
Some people have said that the shroud was his talit, but it's way too big.
Correct. Correct.
Good evening, Mr. Schwartz. How are you? According to the scriptures, it says Nicodemus and a fellow with him brought about 75 pounds of aloe and some spices, basically. I know it's 46 years ago. Was there any sort of testing done on that, any DNA that can show what type of fragrances or spices, if
Okay.
were?
Let's first talk about the spices, okay? Spices are organic compounds, come from plants and stuff. Over 2,000 years, even if they were there, they would dissipate. Our team was there to study the image, so we did not find any traces of spices. One Italian researcher believes he's found some traces of spices, but we didn't, okay? So spices, the other thing is this, if you look at the timeline, I'm not sure they brought the spices to the tomb. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But did they actually have time to apply them to his body when in fact Sabbath was approaching at sundown, and so the intent was to come back Sunday morning and finish? So maybe there were spices in the tomb that hadn't yet been applied. Normal procedure was to apply them, but under those circumstances, maybe they hadn't been applied. And what was the other part of your question? There was something else you said that I wanted to address.
Okay. Hold on. He's coming back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Short-term memory loss, that's what happens when you get old.
There you go.
Part two of that question was basically 46 years ago, was there any DNA involved in the testing?
Thank you.
Sure.
DNA, let's talk about DNA, because today DNA is the miracle solution to everything. Well, in 2008, a paper was published by a Canadian researcher at a Shroud conference here in the US, and it pointed out that human beings are constantly shedding epithelial cells which contain our DNA. So anybody who's touched the shroud, leaned over the shroud, prayed over the shroud, cried over the shroud, or come in any kind of near physical contact with the shroud also left their DNA on it. That includes me, and I happen to be another long-haired Jewish guy. So DNA will never be a very good test on the shroud because of the level of contamination. And to make matters even worse, and this is, you might all want to sit down on this one. In 2002, clandestinely, they did a 32-day intervention where they removed all the patches, they removed the backing sheet, they scraped away charred areas around all the burns, they vacuumed it, they steamed it to get rid of some of the creases and wrinkles, and the two women who did that from Switzerland didn't wear gloves, hairnets, masks, or protective clothing. So now if we do a DNA analysis of the man in the shroud, we're going to find he was a Swiss woman.
Wow. So that DNA was, if there was anything there, now there's added on DNA for everyone else who touched it. Wow, they just destroyed it.
Including my own.
Yeah, wow. Is there anyone else like to ask any more questions? Anybody else? ¿Alguien tiene una pregunta?
Hey, the questions have been good ones.
You have a question, Danny? Yeah? Okay. All right, so I guess people are kind of shy to come up and ask questions, but
Oh, well, here's the thing. Look, I'm just a regular guy and no questions are off limits, so ask away.
so maybe I'll ask this question that I didn't hear anybody ask. Are you coming up for questions? Okay. So one of the things that a lot of people say, well, the shroud is a fake, and the reason why it's a fake was because they did carbon dating on it, and they found out the dating of the carbon dating did not match the age of the supposed shroud. So give us some information about that.
Boy, that's a whole presentation in its own right. It really is. There's a new book out in the past year or so by Joe Marino. It's over 800 pages, and it's everything that happened before, during, and after the radiocarbon dating. And for each bulleted chunk of information, he also gives you the reference from where that comes.
Wow.
That's called good science. So here's the shortest answer I can give you. The radiocarbon dating of the shroud only used a single sample from an area of the shroud that was in question. Had they looked, remember, they made sure the STIRP team, our team, weren't involved. This was 10 years later. I believe that because they didn't want a bunch of really hardcore good scientists looking over their shoulders. Because I believe the three labs had every intention of claiming it was a fake, no matter what the results were. And they were going to tweak the data to make sure that's what happened, because they knew if they said the shroud was authentic, they were going to be the laughing stock of the scientific community. But if they said it was a fake, it would promote the heck out of radiocarbon dating and turn it into the multi-million-dollar industry that it is today. They used the shroud very successfully, I might add, to promote their own technology.
Yeah, because
What can I tell you?
Because I heard that part of it was because they took, as you said, a piece of the shroud that might have been a repair piece that was done later on.
Absolutely.
That's why the dates are incorrect.
Okay, so here's the deal. First of all, had they looked at just even my white light photographs of the shroud in that corner, and people have asked why I didn't do close-ups, because we did this 10 years earlier, not knowing that 10 years later a bunch of guys from 3 radiocarbon labs would pick a terrible spot to do the dating from. So that sample was a strip that they cut out. If you look at my white light photographs, you'll see it's a different color than the adjacent part of the shroud. It's a darker brown there. That's the strip they cut out. Then they cut it in half, put half aside, and took the other half and cut it in thirds and gave it to the 3 labs. And even then, they got inconsistent results from one end of the strip to the other, hundreds of years difference. Now, any scientist will tell you that if you're going to take that strip, okay, fair enough, go somewhere else on that cloth and get a control sample. Get a sample that's separate, doesn't have to be an image area, but just a control sample of the cloth itself.
Right.
Non-image area, whatever. They didn't do that. I don't think they wanted to do that because it served their purpose. But then it gets even uglier. So there were 3 laboratories, Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona here in the US. But the supervisor of the 3 labs was Dr. Michael Tite of the British Museum, chief researcher at the British Museum, pretty big time scientist in his own right. We didn't find out until just a couple of years ago, with Joe Marino doing research for his book, that Dr. Michael Tite was already in negotiations with the Oxford lab to take a permanent chair at Oxford. And as soon as the results were leaked, before the paper was even published, Oxford received £1 million, about $2.5 million. And Dr. Michael Tite resigned from the British Museum and took a permanent chair at Oxford with some of that money. What can I say?
Wow.
I hate to think it was about the money, but on the other hand, it is a multi-million-dollar business now.
That's right. That's right. So
And they did it on the Shroud of Turin.
Wow. Good, Karen.
Shalom, Barry. This might be a silly
Shalom.
question, But
The only silly question's the one you didn't ask.
how tall would he have been?
Good question. I'm going to give you the approximate answer first, and then I'll explain why it's an approximate answer. I would say 5'10" to 5'11" at the most. Ladies, if you know what a herringbone weave is, it's 3/2 herringbone twill. It stretches in every direction very easily. We had to be very careful when we handled the shroud and laid it on our table, not to stretch it, to smooth it, but without pulling on it to stretch it, because you can then distort the image. So that's one thing. The other thing is this. The shroud's image can change its dimensions by as many as 4 or 5 centimeters just based on the relative humidity in which it's stored. The other thing is even more difficult to understand, but if you look at the shroud's image, it doesn't have any distinct edges. Like any artwork, the artist always starts with the outline. There's no outline on the shroud. The image, because it's based on distance, fades out at the periphery. Consequently, precise measurements from the shroud are very difficult, if not impossible, to make with any real precision.
Right.
So we can estimate 5'10", maybe 5'11", but after that restoration I mentioned where they did all that stuff they did to it, the shroud is 7 to 10 centimeters longer than it was before. So how much did that impact the height of the man of the shroud in the image? We don't know.
Correct. He could have been
So
shorter, but
again, yeah, there's some things that the shroud can tell us and some maybe not so much.
because of, I guess, all the, regulations to get through now, red tape, for you to actually to see and do these tests again on the Shroud of Turin, we could probably know beyond a shadow of a doubt with the new science if there's anything else out there for us to discover.
Yeah.
Because we can't now, and we do know that
Well-
to someone to do a forgery of that type, thinking of all these things they had to think about, and also making it a 3D image,
Well, look, first of all, it's just one man who has the final say now.
Correct.
1983, King Umberto, the last owner of the shroud, died, the one who gave us permission. Unlike his family going back 500 years, instead of leaving the shroud to his son, he opted to leave it not to the church as an institution, which would have required 130 cardinals to vote on something, and he knew that wasn't going to be very efficient. He felt it should be in the hands of one person, the living Pope, and so once his will was probated in 1985, he died in 83, it became the legal owner became Pope John Paul II. Upon his passing, it became Benedict, and upon his resignation and retirement, it became Francis. So only one person has the ultimate authority to say yes or no to that. And as I pointed out, it wasn't the church that gave us permission to examine the shroud.
Right.
If it were up to the church, we never would have been given that permission.
All right, okay, Barry, I have another question. The
Okay.
image that is on the shroud, how was it caused? Like, if one had died regularly and buried, obviously, you wouldn't be checking a shroud that, like you said, was very important and was saved. So, if something, how would the image have come on the shroud that we can see it? Could it have been something supernatural? Could it have been some type of a flash of light or something like that?
Definitely not light.
Okay.
I'll tell you why. If you look at the photomicrographs, the photographs of the shroud made through the microscope, you can see on the top surface of the fibrils the yellow color. But in the valleys between those fibers, if it were light would get in there and we would see color there too. Well, we don't. Light is not the answer, okay? Now, when you talk about supernatural, I'm going to tell you, because that comes up all the time, obviously, I'm going to tell you what I always tell everybody. I said, look, there's no scientific test for resurrection or Christness, okay? That's a test of faith, not a test of science. Unless we could go into a room and resurrect people to see what kind of images we can make, science can't go there. So here's what I tell people all the time. I say, look, I represent the science of the shroud, but I also acknowledge that there's something called faith, that many people believe in the shroud, less about the science and more from their hearts and their faith. So I always tell people, follow your heart and listen to what your heart tells you, but don't expect science to prove your faith, because I've often said that if you need science to support your faith, then the problem isn't the science, it's your faith. And you should go back and re-examine your faith, because the whole concept of faith is to accept without evidence, without having tangible proof. And so faith is something that comes from within. And I'll say this is maybe the best summary of that concept. Science must remain within the observable and the measurable. Faith has no boundary.
I apologize. I know exactly what you're saying. Just real quick. But how would that image be on the shroud? Like that you're seeing?
Listen.
Would that happen to
Okay,
anybody?
no. Well, here's the thing. Think about this. How many burial shrouds are intact after being in the grave for a period of time? None.
Right.
Or burial shrouds are organic and they decompose with the body, along with the body. This particular burial shroud was removed from the body or separated from the body within about 36 to 40 hours, long before the products of decomposition would have begun to leak out of the body. It's kind of a gross topic. So there's no obvious signs of decomposition there. However, the body starts emanating amines, starting with ammonia from your nose and mouth right after death. And we don't have enough data yet to exclude the possibility of a natural explanation within God's creation that could create an image on a piece of linen. I mean, does God need to do magic tricks to put an image on linen? God doesn't need to. Maybe we do.
Yeah.
But I don't think God does. And here's the other thing. Faith has no boundaries. You have to remember that. So if I could answer your question honestly, the only correct question or answer to your question about, well, what did cause the image there was, we don't know. That's the honest answer.
That's right.
You won't get too many scientists willing to admit that.
Well, and
But the
also
good ones will.
There's also the fact that there hasn't been more studies done on the shroud to really try to determine even more. But what
Only
they
once.
do know of that time is like they don't know. To this day, we don't know.
Think about this. We went there to answer a single question, how's the image formed? Came back unable to answer the question. We can tell you what it's not. It's not a painting, it's not a scorch, it's not a photograph, not a rubbing. But we don't know of a mechanism yet that can create an image with these properties. However, Ray Rogers, again, the chemist from Los Alamos, I keep bringing him up because he was such an important contributor to shroud science. He died before he completed his research, but there's another young man, I say younger man now, Kelly Kearse, who's a blood and DNA expert, immunologist, and a high school teacher. He chose not to go into the college academia and prefers to teach young people about science. But he's published a bunch of papers, and Rogers told me before he died that there was something else at work besides what he called the Maillard reaction, which would have caused the yellow color on the shroud. But he said something else is at work, and Kelly Kearse just recently published a paper that may answer that question that Rogers was unable to answer. So think about this. We've had one opportunity to examine this cloth in its entire history, and that was 46 years ago. Given another opportunity to go back, perhaps we could answer that question and the many new questions that came up out of the data that we collected.
You know,
We brought back a lot of new questions.
One of the things, and Barrie and I have talked several times on the phone. One of the things that helped me come to my conclusion, which I'm going to say now, okay? I had one question for Barrie, and Barrie was able to answer that question for me. So like Barrie, that took him so many years after to acknowledge what he believed, to be true concerning the shroud, I can say now beyond a shadow of a doubt and with all the biblical evidence is proven, and by him answering the question about the coins, that I believe that the man on the shroud is Yeshua. To us, HaMoshiach, the Messiah.
Yeah, and I understand that. I don't go there. I'm not a rabbi or a priest or a minister. It's not my job. I always point to the religious leader in the room because I'm usually in a room with a religious leader of some sort.
Right.
And so I always point and I say, well, that's Rabbi's job or that's Father's job. My job is to present you with the evidence that convinced me solely by the science. It's got to be the real thing. Add to that your faith, all bets are off. Believe
Amen.
what you wish.
Amen. Another question here?
Yes. Hey, Barrie. One final question from me. When we were discussing the blood earlier, was there a blood sample taken? And if so, any idea if they did a chromosome test on that, like around Wyatt with the...
Far too old for that. That's way far too old for that. There's some people who've made claims about that, but there's no science to back it up. I mean, people make claims about anything they want on the internet. There's no peer review on the internet.
Right.
It's a good thing too, because it would drive the peer reviewers crazy in about 2 hours.
Right.
So, but
Yep.
the real science is published in credible journals
Right.
where there is peer review, so that the techniques that are applied, the methodology that's applied, the conclusions that are drawn are evaluated by other experts of a similar or same discipline. That's peer review.
Right. So one of the things is probably that those type of tests weren't actually done on the shroud. What you're talking about is more of, how you call it, what a Ron Wyatt did is a different type of thing that he
Ron
did.
Wyatt, total, complete nonsense.
Yeah.
Listen,
So, yeah, it's
if
different.
you're going to tell me something about the shroud, it has to be consistent with what's been documented on the cloth itself.
Correct.
Nothing Ron Wyatt said comes even close. I have pre-written responses to people who bring Ron Wyatt up to me. And I say, I'm sure he meant well, but he was completely wrong about just about everything. But I imagine he sold some books and made some money.
Well, we thank you, Barrie, for coming to the show and for revealing all these interesting facts. Please tell us, one of your final thoughts also where people can support or find more information concerning the Shroud of Turin.
Sure. Obviously, our website is www.shroud.com. The site grew so large, it's 28 years old. There aren't many people who can claim to have a 28-year-old website, by the way. It got so large that I couldn't find stuff that I knew was there. So there's a search engine on Shroud.com that only searches within Shroud.com. So if you go to Shroud.com, you can go to the website, go to the front page, there's a search box, type in anything you want. I think most of you know how to use the search engine these days. It's become quite common and popular. And you should be able to find just about anything you're looking for if you use the search engine properly. So that's a good starting place. And there are also links to massive amounts of other material on the Shroud. So I always tell people when you're going to Shroud.com, especially if you intend to do a little in-depth research, pack a lunch and a snack. You'll need it.
Thank you so much, Barrie. Truly appreciate that. And we thank you so much for coming in and being part of our web show and helping us with all of our questions and finding out the truth about the Shroud of Turin. And it's something so vital today as it was all those years ago. And I'm sure it's going to be around for many more years until the Moshiach returns himself.
God willing and amen.
Thank you for joining us, Barrie.
All right, shalom, everybody. Thank you very
Shalom,
much.
shalom.
Hey, and next year, go Eagles and Steelers.
All right, Barry, thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Please support this ministry by going to our webpage, bethemanuel.org, and you can go there and you support this ministry that way. You could also write to us and give us information there as well. You can write to us at congregationbethemanuelphila@gmail.com. If you have any questions for any of our guests that has come here in the past, or any suggestions for new guests that you may have, you can write to us that way as well. But please stop by and show support and subscribe and tell people about what you've seen, what you've learned, what you'd like to see in the future. And we'll join you once again on Walking the Footsteps of the Moshiach. This is your host, Rabbi David Vazquez, and Shalom.